For decades, America's biggest fear was not always the oil it could see. It was the oil moving far away, through narrow waters, hidden terminals, and tanker routes that could shake prices thousands of miles away. At the center of that story is Iran, a country with one of the most important oil machines on Earth. From Karg Island to the Strait of Hormuz, millions of barrels moved through a system that became too powerful for the world to ignore. The US may not completely depend on Iranian oil the way it once did, but one disruption in this region can completely devastate the American markets. So how did Iran build this machine? And why does Washington still watch it so closely? In the late 1970s, oil from Iran was arriving in the United States at a speed that would be hard to understand today. At the height of this relationship, the United States was importing hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per day from Iran. In 1977 and 1978, some months were above 700,000 barrels per day. That was not millions of barrels directly into America, but it was enough to matter. Iran was a major supplier, and the United States was still deeply dependent on foreign oil. Not until the system finally broke. In 1978, strikes spread through Iran's oil fields as the revolution gathered force. The world suddenly lost one of its major sources of crude. By January 1979, Iranian output had dropped by about 4.8 million barrels per day. Then came the hostage crisis. On November 12, 1979, President Jimmy Carter announced that the United States would stop buying oil from Iran for delivery into the country.
We hold the government of Iran fully responsible for the well-being and the safe return of every single person.
The statement was political, but it was also economic. The old energy relationship had become indefensible. Iran was no longer seen as a normal supplier. It had become a hostile power, sitting on one of the world's most valuable oil systems. But after direct Iranian oil mostly disappeared from American ports, Iran's oil did not disappear from the world. And at the center of that machine was a small island in the Persian Gulf. Karg Island sits northwest of Bushehr, off Iran's coast, in the northern Persian Gulf. On a map, it looks small. This island became the main exit door for Iranian crude. Pipelines from the mainland bring oil toward its storage tanks. Loading arms and offshore berths connect the island to the tankers waiting at sea. From there, the crude can move into the Persian Gulf, toward the Strait of Hormuz, and then out toward Asia, Europe, or the wider tanker market. Karg Island has the ability to load about 7 million barrels of oil per day, and it can handle multiple supertankers at the same time. That does not mean Iran exports that amount every day. Its actual exports are far lower, especially under sanctions. But the island's capacity shows why it became so important. But the island also became a weakness. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iraqi forces targeted Karg Island several times. The reason was that if an enemy wanted to hurt Iran's economy, it did not need to attack every oil field. It could go after the place where the oil left the country, damage the terminal, and the barrels could pile up inland. The oil would still exist, but it would be trapped. For decades, Iran's oil fields fed this system. In a normal country, this process would be visible through customs data, shipping records, insurance documents, and refinery purchases. In Iran's case, sanctions changed the game. The oil could no longer move openly to many buyers. The United States had banned direct purchases. Later sanctions targeted foreign banks, shipping companies, insurers, brokers, and buyers connected to Iranian petroleum. But oil is different from many other products. It is liquid and can be blended. It can be transferred at sea and moved through middlemen. A barrel loaded at Karg might not arrive at its final buyer with Iran's name printed clearly on every document. Not because the island disappeared. Satellites could still see the tanks. The harder part was proving the final path of every cargo once it entered the world of shadow fleets, offshore transfers, renamed ships, and discounted sales. Iran's crude kept moving because buyers were willing to take the risk for the right price. And the biggest buyer became China. By the 2010s and 2020s, The Iran-US oil relationship had turned upside down. The United States was no longer a major direct buyer of Iranian crude. In fact, the U.S. Energy Information Administration says America has not imported crude oil and condensate from Iran in several decades. But Washington still cared deeply about Iranian exports because oil prices are global. A barrel blocked in the Persian Gulf can affect a barrel sold in Texas. A tanker delayed near Hormuz can affect the price paid by someone filling a car in Ohio. Sanctions became the main weapon. The goal was to reduce the money Iran earned from oil. This mattered because crude exports were a major source of hard currency for Tehran. If sanctions could scare away buyers, banks, insurers, and shipping companies, Iran would be forced to sell less oil or sell it at a discount. For a while, the pressure worked. After the United States withdrew from the nuclear agreement in 2018 and restored sanctions, Iran's exports fell. Congressional research later noted that observed Iranian crude exports dropped by about 80% between April 2018 and October 2019. But Iran adapted. Instead of relying on normal shipping channels, it leaned more heavily on older tankers, middlemen, ship-to-ship transfers, and buyers willing to operate outside the comfort of Western financial rules. The phrase shadow fleet became common in energy reporting. It refers to tankers that operate at the edge of normal maritime trade, often with unclear ownership, changing names, changing flags, or gaps in tracking signals. China became central to this route. Reports say that China bought an average of about 38 million barrels per day of Iranian oil in 2025. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission has also described China as Iran's primary oil buyer. Iran lost many official buyers, but it found one very large buyer. Chinese independent refiners, especially smaller teapot refiners, were attracted to Iranian crude because it was cheaper than non-sanctioned oil. A discount of several dollars per barrel can become a huge saving when the cargo is measured in millions of barrels. This is how Iran's oil continued to earn tens of billions of dollars a year. This is why the United States keeps trying to squeeze. In 2025, the U.S. Treasury said it had sanctioned more than 170 vessels involved in transporting Iranian petroleum and petroleum products. That gives a sense of how large the hidden network had become. But sanctions have one major problem: they can make oil harder to sell. And every route out of the Persian Gulf eventually faces one narrow gate. The Strait of Hormuz is where the story becomes global. In 2024, about 20 million barrels per day of oil moved through the Strait of Hormuz. That was about 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. In 2025, the International Energy Agency estimated that nearly 20 million barrels per day of oil exports still went through the strait, with most of that flow heading to Asia. Millions of barrels from the Persian Gulf were moving through a corridor that still affected the United States. In 2024, America imported about 0.5 million barrels per day of crude oil and condensate from Persian Gulf countries through the Strait of Hormuz. That was only about 7% of U.S. crude imports and 2% of U.S. petroleum liquids consumption. But the impact of Hormuz is much larger than direct U.S. imports. If China, India, Japan, and South Korea suddenly lose access to Gulf crude, they will look for replacement barrels. They compete for cargoes from West Africa, Latin America, the United States, and elsewhere. That extra demand pushes up prices. American refiners may be using domestic crude, Canadian crude, or Gulf Coast supply, but they still operate inside the same global market. This is why a disruption near Iran can raise prices for people who have never bought Iranian oil in their lives. The strait also gives Iran leverage. Iran does not need to control the whole global oil market to influence it. Sitting beside Hormuz is enough to make traders nervous. A threat, a tanker incident, a military crisis, or a sudden insurance spike can make oil more expensive before any major supply loss even happens. There are bypass routes, but they are limited. These alternatives help, but they cannot replace the whole flow through Hormuz. And behind that door sits Karg Island, still loading the crude that keeps the machine alive.